So welcome everyone to ICA, to Sheila Sanchez's show, and to the last event of our summer intensive. The summer intensive is what we do for our research center, which is our kind of pedagogical platform of graduate school seminars, that sort of thing. This summer, we did it on Afro-Cuba, and it's part of a larger effort to kind of think of the region we live in. So last spring, we did Arts of Jamaica. The year before, we did Haiti. So all these things that we often claim as part of the identity of our city, we just want to fill it in with some kind of actual historical material. So that's our goal. And lastly, I want to thank the Knight Foundation, who have been really great at funding these programs and everything we do here. And I just want to introduce Stephan Palmié, who's the Edna Norman Freeling Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. He's the author of many books. His most recent one is Thinking with Ngangas, What Afro-Cuban Ritual Can Tell Us About Scientific Praxis and Vice Versa. He's also an editor of several volumes of Caribbean Afro-Atlantic Anthropology and History. You should look at a book called The Cooking of History, which I think you would enjoy if you enjoy this theme quite a bit. Well, without further ado, Stephan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jean, for that gracious introduction, and thanks again for bringing us here. It's been a pleasure spending the last 3 days with, our seminar participants, and I have to apologize because I'm flying right back to Chicago after my talk, so fortunately I have to miss the rest of the symposium, but hope you'll enjoy it. So, every discipline must have a canon of works that its practitioners cannot well ignore, but nonetheless feel deeply ambivalent about. Lydia Cabrera's oeuvre is a case in point, at least for the subset of anthropologists who care about Afro-Atlantic and more specifically Afro-Cuban ritual traditions. Cabrera was without doubt the most prolific ethnographer of mid-20th century Afro-Cuban ritual, rivaled only by her brother-in-law Fernando Ortiz, and maybe the trained pharmacist Rómulo Lachadaniere and the Reglano schoolteacher Teodoro Diaz-Favela. Yet in contrast to Ortiz, and for a number of reasons that I will focus on here, professional anthropologists have always had a troubled relation to her work. Taking the recent publication of an English translation of her magnum opus, El Monte, and the 70th anniversary of the first publication of this book in 1954 as an occasion, my talk today aims to revisit the question of why El Monte occupies such a problematic position within my discipline. What I want to suggest is this. We know that every organized scholarly pursuit necessarily generates a historically mutable thought collective, as the brilliant Polish physician Ludwig Fleck argued in 1935. Yet given that such thought collectives are structured around what Foucault would call no less historical epistemes and their discursive regimes, it may be time to read El Monte again, and in English translation, and an English translation very much in tune with contemporary concerns. I will also argue that we should do so with a healthy dose of suspicion of the representationalism that until fairly recently had been the hallmark of any ethnographic monograph worthy of the name. El Monte was something to its readers back in the 1950s, but the book, and especially its English translation, may well be a different thing to us now. Perhaps we can learn something new and unexpected this time around. But let me begin with a bit of contextualization. That Lydia Cabrera's magnum opus is now finally available in English is an unqualified reason to celebrate. However, the prehistory of David Font-Navarrete's valiant efforts at finally making this book available to an Anglophone audience deserves brief consideration. Efforts to translate Cabrera's book go back all the way to the 1970s. A footnote in the translation that adds to Schwed and Thompson's 1982 foreword, itself now an old document of older approaches to the subject, nods to this complicated and rather less than happy history in mentioning the late Eliot Klein. An antiquarian bookseller with a Yale MA in medieval German literature, Klein was granted exclusive translation rights by Cabrera in the 1980s for reasons that, to my knowledge, no one has ever been able to clarify. Klein subsequently embarked on a decades-long quixotic quest to correct the errors in Cabrera's text. His project was to re-research El Monte all over again, as if there were a way to time tunnel back into the second third of the 20th century to uncover the truth about what Cabrera's interlocutors had really meant to say or should have said. Every bit like a mix between Borges' Pierre Menard and Melville's Captain Ahab's obsession, Klein's Platonic fantasy about an ur-form of El Monte never led to any tangible results. But he still managed to block all previous and further attempts at translation into English. I mean, there are French and Italian translations. I could tell you more about Klein, but if for reasons of time, I just won't go into that now. After Cabrera's literary executor, Isabel Castellanos, deposited her papers in the University of Miami's Cuban Heritage Collection, and Klein had died in 2016, Font-Navarrete eventually took on the gargantuan task, and Duke University Press published the resulting behemoth in almost coffee table format, complete with a handsome cover design featuring artwork by José Bedilla, a far cry from the modest cover of the 1954 first edition in Cabrera's and María Teresa Rojas ediciones CIR. Now, first and foremost, Font-Navarrete must be complimented for his remarkable sensitivity in navigating Cabrera's often highly idiosyncratic prose, his careful footnotes, and not the least, his excellent translator's notes, tellingly subtitled Reading El Monte in the 21st Century. Almost 70 years after its first publication in a language where some of Cabrera's writing cannot but convey a sense of troubling race and class-based condescension, Font-Navarrete's English translation of El Monte must be read as a different book, a new book perhaps. The question then becomes what kind of text the translator's efforts have now made available to non-Hispanophones. Cabrera's biography is fairly well known, but Isabel Castellanos' introduction to the English edition will serve as an enduring contribution to her hagiography as the pre-revolutionary upper-class Cuban moana mundele, that is, white woman, who devoted her life to the collection of Afro-Cuban myths and folktales, ethnobotanical data, the lexicon of 3 different African-derived ritual languages spoken in Cuba at mid-century, and a staggering amount of detail about her interlocutors' ritual practices. Cabrera's intellectual formation took place in surrealist circles in 1930s Paris. She never underwent initiation in any of the ritual traditions that she studied, and she eschewed any academic credentials or pretensions. How intriguing, then, that her translator is an American Latino, an initiated son of Obatala, a bata drummer, and a professor of ethnomusicology at CUNY. Earlier anthropologists might have spoken of a structural inversion here, such as, author to translator equals female to male, equals non-academic to academic, equals non-initiate to initiate, and so forth. Today, we might speak of cultural reappropriation. As a German-born Allegio, that is non-initiate, who has spent much of his adult life studying matters Afro-Cuban, I think that is just how it should be. Now, since Cabrera left the island shortly after the Cuban Revolution and in fact published most of her work in exile, it was not before the final opening of party membership to religious practitioners in 1991 that her work was republished on the island. But an edition of El Monte, published in Miami, was already widely circulating when I commenced my own fieldwork on Afro-Cuban ritual practice in Miami in 1985. And it was circulating not just among academics, but among practitioners who were often only too keen to point out that El Monte represented a skewed image of what they, by then, had come to call their religion. But of course, they nonetheless selectively minded. It didn't help that Cabrera, who was still alive at the time, repeatedly stated that she would have no truck with the Afro-Cuban religious diaspora that had emerged in Miami, declaring that she didn't want to spoil her fond memories of pre-revolutionary Cuba. As she writes on page 396, the golden age of Santeria was at the turn of the 20th century. Her aging informants who worked with her between the 1930s and 1950s tend to agree. Cabrera doesn't seem to have worked with babalaos much. Maybe her gender and sexual orientation intervened, though it doesn't seem to have mattered in the case of Abacoa. If she had, perhaps the irony that, as David Brown has documented, the initiatory mechanisms for reproducing Ifa on the island was literally cooked up in the last years of the 19th century by little more than a handful of elderly Africans in La Habana's barrio of Jesus Maria and the third ward of the municipality of Regla. That this golden age, as she called it, also coincided with massive amounts of repression of African-derived ritual practices and the massacre of thousands of black supporters of the Partido Independiente de Color in 1912, that is yet another story. Although El Monte was in many ways a high modernist experiment on the borders of ethnography and the literature that Alejo Carpentier dubbed Lo Real Maravilloso, already in 1954, Cabrera's tone was thus decidedly one of romantic nostalgia. As she herself repeatedly indicates in El Monte and later explicitly spelled out in her version of the genre of instructional Manuales de Santeria, Coeco y Avo, Aprende Novicia, published in 1980, her aim had much in common with the North American genre of salvage ethnography, the documentation of quote-unquote authentic cultural difference before it became engulfed and diluted by implicitly white modernity. Cabrera's language occasionally falls in with the worst characteristics of this genre. Think of Ruth Benedict's 1934, in many ways courageous relativistic, but nowadays utterly cringeworthy defense of trans states or male homosexuality in her essay Anthropology and the, guess what, abnormal, when you read the following lines, and I quote Cabrera now. The extreme case with which people of color and whites of color fall in trance or with santo can be attributed to their predisposition to autosuggestion, which, as we already emphasized, is congenital among the majority, to their astonishingly childlike psychology, to their impressionable nature, to their ancient religious traditions. Now, this is just an excerpt from a much longer passage, and it is by no means the only one of that tenor in the book. Pity the poor translator who has to footnote each and every instance of such language, rife as it seems to be with resonances to the early work of Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, whose armchair disquisitions on mystical participation and a pre-logical mentality allegedly common to members of inferior societies, Cabrera might have as well come across during her Parisian years, but probably didn't. She came up with that language herself. Cabrera's method, however, could hardly have been any more different from the systematic holism and representationalism of the tribal ethnographies produced by the first and second generation of trained anthropologists on the other side of the Florida Straits. If Bowers reluctantly gave a stamp of institutional approval to Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men, published in 1935, by writing a preface, perhaps to try to rein in his wayward student, then Fernando Ortiz seems to have wanted to contain Cabrera by writing a rather paternalizing preface to the Spanish edition of Cabrera's first book, Cuentos Negros, in 1940. Of course, Cabrera was never Ortiz's student, but his sister-in-law, and her dedication of El Monte to the aging Ortiz in fraternal affection may have been her way of returning the favor, tongue-in-cheek. Take this, cuñado antropólogo. Allegedly, she was happy to have tripped Ortiz up when he mistakenly accepted some of her just-so stories as genuine mythology, such as the one about a high god allegedly creating humans out of his own poop. Be that as it may, independently wealthy and intellectually footloose as Cabrera was, El Monte burst on the Cuban literary scene like a shooting star in 1954. Completely unprecedented, disciplinarily unfettered, and entirely sui generis. If anything, perhaps Michel Léry's similarly surrealism-inspired, labyrinthine, and wildly iconoclastic Afrique Fantôme might be the closest point of comparison. That book was published in 1934. As a result, the reader, then as now, finds themselves embarking on an errand into the wilderness. El Monte is an impossibly complex, multi-voiced, and recursively reticulated book that makes for a dizzying read. For one thing, you never really know who's talking in this heteroglossic intentional hybrid of a text in Bakhtin's sense. Is it one of her named interlocutors, Calasan Herrera, Gavino Sandoval, J.S. Baró, Omitomi, and so on? Is it an anonymous source, a centenarian in Matanzas, a young Ialocha in La Habana? You never know who is speaking or interrupting some other narrator's reported speech. Is it Cabrera herself? Sometimes lack of quotation marks seem to indicate that. But then, sometimes quotation marks open and they never close. At times, Cabrera even interrupts herself, as when she pauses her narrative for her close confidant, Omitomi's harrowing biography in mid-paragraph and shifts to an almost page-long digression on General Martínez Campos, San Ramón Nonato, and other Catholic celestial doctors helpful in childbirth. Now, one suspects that there is method in this madness. And there is, but it is certainly not that of an academic ethnographer at mid-20th century. Still, to even ask this question may already be to take the wrong turn in approaching Cabrera's stunningly original contribution. As she puts it on the very first page, my method, and I quote, was imposed by the explanations and digressions, each inseparable from the rest of my informants. But her authorities not only include oral data, stories heaped upon stories by her aging interlocutors, they also include written text, the Abaqua and Ifa libretas, laboriously copied by hand by Cabrera's informants in highly idiosyncratic Hispanophone renderings of African-derived sacrilegs, and to this day subjected to endless exegetical discussions. The Cuban ethnographer and musicologist Argelius Leon once called this a case of written oral tradition. Cabrera even thanks interlocutors who lied to her, and by her own admission, one suspects that there were quite a few of them. El Monte is thus decidedly not an ethnography of Afro-Cuban ritual and belief, and anthropologists trying to mine it for usable data on mid-20th century practices have found themselves endlessly frustrated. Why all this incessant disagreement among Cabrera's informants about matters of ritual and theology? Don't they have a coherent belief system? Is it Cabrera who gets it wrong? Can we simply pick and choose? The answer is no. To read El Monte with such questions in mind is to profoundly misunderstand the book, the very nature of its subject, and Cabrera's genuinely precocious contribution. As her close confidant Calasan wisely puts it, quote, "The truth is scattered all over the place, and you have to walk a long road to gather it one small bit at a time." In 1954, monographs aiming to systematize the quote-unquote worldview or belief system of Santeria in a representationalist fashion, the X believe that Y, or in Y. And here one thinks of, for example, Mercedes Gross Sandoval's 1975 La Religión Afro-Cubana, or Miguel Barnet, 1995 Cultus Afro-Cubanos. Such books still lay decades in the future. When I first read El Monte as a graduate student, I read it as a vexingly questionable source of ethnographic data. Why was there not the faintest shred of sociological contextualization? We know that Omitomi was Cabrera's family's seamstress. We also learned that Calasan once practiced the trade of a shoemaker and that he tended to treat women badly. At one point, Cabrera tells us of a thriving trade in trabajos for government employees desperate to hold on to their jobs. Or about the municipal government of Marianao cutting down a particularly venerable ceiba tree because the putrefying offerings at its feet were becoming a public health hazard. And here I recommend Cristina Wirtz's excellent 2009 essay on Basura Santa. But that's about it. That's about all we learn. Why don't we get any information about the social circumstances of the people that Cabrera often, rather nonchalantly, calls mis viejos negros? And why is there no info at all about the context in which they shared their views with her? And can we really believe Cabrera when she avers that her goal was merely to, quote, present living documents that I've been fortunate to discover, offering materials for specialists that have not passed through the dangerous filter of interpretation? Can we really believe that? She herself may have thought so. As Isabel Castellanos, who knew her very well, tells us, Cabrera liked to say that she saw her ethnographic and authorial agency as that of a mere channel of transmission for the knowledge of her aging black sages. If so, why then is the signal, as it comes through in El Monte, so riddled with the noise of a rather self-assured authorial voice? But again, as with Elliot Klein's former quest for a timeless ethnographic reality behind Cabrera's text, trying to strip El Monte of Cabrera's authorial voice and agency to arrive at ethnographic fact can only lead to the frustrated puzzlement that I, and I'm sure many others, experienced upon first trying to read the book as a source for data. More than 40 years later, I now read El Monte differently, namely as a piece of high modernist experimental writing, more akin to, say, Finnegan's Wake than to witchcraft, oracles, and magic among the Asande. A text that recursively replicates the enchanted wilderness to which its title refers in the form of an ethnographically based agencement of various interacting voices. In line with such considerations, we might perhaps best approach El Monte itself as a trabajo, that is, a magical works, or even as a nganga, a composite power object of sorts, intended less to educate than to enchant the reader's mind, and to thereby replicate the very nature of its subject, a set of living and therefore necessarily contested traditions, perhaps best understood in the moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre's sense as a long conversation where its participants need not agree on anything but the moral and ethical value of continuing to argue with each other. Or in this case, to surrender to the spell of a sacred, undomesticated, and highly agentive monte that can be encountered not only in El Campo Profundo, but in overgrown vacant lots in the capital city itself, or even underneath the magnificent ceiba tree in La Havana's Parque de la Fraternidad Panamericana, where the erstwhile dictator Gerardo Machado's Nganga is said to be buried, or which in itself may constitute a Nganga, what with the earth in which were planted that came from 21 locations across the Americas, what with the gold coins deposited underneath it, or the iron arrows adorning its fence, reminiscent of both of divine attributes of Lukumi deities, Nkongo, Gandos, or Firmas. Magical realism, this may well be. But to me, it is ethnographically far more realistic than the bland listings of deities and their attributes that Cabrera's successors have tended to offer. My own interlocutors in Miami and later in Havana incessantly disagreed as well. And that may well be as it should be. There is, of course, nothing wrong in saying that Chango's color is red, that he's the owner of the drum, a womanizer in mythology, that he eats ram, gets syncretized with Santa Barbara, and so on and so forth. Once you ask the right, or rather wrong, question, you'll surely get just such responses. But wait until you read one of Cabrera's interlocutors called Chango the owner of the atom bomb, only a few years after the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the time of my first fieldwork in Miami, Babalu Aye had taken on HIV/AIDS as part of his divine portfolio, and as everyone who monitors the online IFA pronouncements for the coming year, the Letras del Año, that a good dozen of globally dispersed associations of Babalaos issue every December 31st, these traditions are as expansive in their capacity to assimilate the present as they are fiercely protective of their necessarily divergent notions of what constitutes past precedent in ritual tradition and proper exegesis. To be sure, Cabrera could have never anticipated any of this in her wildest dreams. I mean, which child of the 20th century could have? Given the disdain that she expressed towards the transformation of botanical materia magica, like amanzahuapo, into aerosol sprays in Miami's Botanicas, who knows what she would have thought of what Aisha Beliso de Jesus in 2015 called electric Santeria. But with hindsight, we can now imagine that she showed us the way, or maybe a way. For consider this, given that already during the time of her own fieldwork, some of her informants were claiming that their traditions were going to hell in a handbag, might it not be that an ideology of neophobia masking rampant innovation has always been part and parcel of the reproduction of Afro-Cuban ritual traditions? Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. My late colleague Marshall Salins would have called this stereotypical reproduction. Why should the Orisha not have taken to the internet? Or have chosen to live on the memory sticks that Cubans nowadays call el paquete? Almost half of El Monte's main text is organized around two trees, the ceiba and the royal palm, and their cosmological and ritual significance. Famously, however, El Monte contains an ethnobotanical encyclopedia of almost 300 pages, complete with Linnaean classifications, Lukumi, Congo, Spanish, and now English glosses. Here, science meets magic. And contrary to Sir James Fraser, it is clear which one of them gets the upper hand, and it certainly is not science. According to Cabrera, it is not that you are mistaken if you think that you can coerce the world when you don't know how it works. That's Fraser's position. It is that you are mistaken if you want the world to change and don't pay for it. A long time ago, a kindly santera once told me after performing, I think it was a despojo for me, and I quote, "Of course you can leave as little or as much money on my altar as you wish, but you know, my dear, the more you give..." At which point I stupidly blurted out, yes, yes, the more I give, the more I get. To which she gently answered, "No, mijo, es al revés. The more you give, the more I have." So with El Monte, and one of Cabrera's genuine achievements is to have pointed out that these ritual traditions, which after all grew out of the crucible of a violent Atlantic modernity, they have no pretensions to Edenic forms of uncommodified exchange. You can't just piously pay respect to El Monte, you have to pay it. Most entries in this section of the book are short and irrelevant to any but the most pedantic ethnobotanist. But some, like the entries for algodón, coco, huira, or maíz, are mini-montes themselves, going on for pages and pages, presenting information on crucial ritual procedures, and being, of course, riddled with contradictions, digressions, dissenting voices, and stories upon stories. So what to do with this book and its positively, even preposterously undisciplined nature? Surely, to treat it as a document of mid-20th century Afro-Cuban ritual knowledge and practice in any straightforward way would be just as daft as trying to read Finnegan's Wake as a document of early 20th century Irish funerary customs. To his great credit, Font-Navarrete is well aware of this, and his translation is sensitive to the fact that it must cross not only linguistic and cultural, but historical boundaries. Cabrera was who she was, and there's no denying that her positionality informed, at least in good part, what she decided to tell us. By the same token, there is today no way that we could make Cabrera's mindset nor language, let alone her studious neglect of her own positionality, our own. Love it or leave it, anthropologists. Still, Font-Navarrete's reappropriation of Cabrera's text for a 21st century Anglophone audience, including not just scholars but also practitioners, proves that we do not have to relinquish El Monte to literary or cultural studies scholars, some of whose interpretations of Cabrera as a post-colonial, post-modern, queer writer avant la lettre might have astounded Cabrera herself. And Lisa actually has written a pretty trenchant critique of one such book. Of course, I hasten to add here that members of my guild neither can nor ought to assert an interpretive monopoly on Cabrera's deliberate and quite luxuriously undisciplined oeuvre. Different from her brother-in-law, Fernando Ortiz, Cabrera started out not as a lawyer entranced by positivistic theories of racially conceived criminal atavism, only to eventually convert himself into a champion of Africa's contribution to a Cuban national project. Her goal had been to become a painter. Cabrera carefully crafted her own biography, and in the one interview that I was fortunate enough to get from her in the spring of 1985, she reiterated what she often called her discovery of Cuba at the banks of the Seine. After having been exposed to the Borobudur frieze during her studies of Asian art at the École de Louvre it dawned upon her that the stories her black nannies had told her were no less worthy of being enshrined in a Western artistic canon or appropriated into it, as we might be inclined to say today. I mean, what with the provenance of non-Western artworks in First World museums in moments of sheer loot and imperial violence. All that may have been so, but much like her brother-in-law, Don Fernando, she always took care to cover up her tracks. Realizing that I was from Munich, Lydia went out of her way to talk about her experience of Hitler's failed 1923 coup, which she alleged to have witnessed. I had thought then that she hadn't gotten to Europe until 1927, but chances are that she could have been in Munich in 1923 on an earlier trip. But that's another story altogether, and one that greatly annoyed me at the time. Here's my chance to talk to the Grande Dame of Afro-Cuban Studies, and she tells me that? Perhaps I should have been a better listener. What was it that she, blind and nearly deaf, was trying to tell a youthful German ethnographer who had washed up on her doorstep? Well, I missed that chance. We know that Cabrera hated Cuba's revolutionary government. She hated Miami, hated her situation in exile, honorary degrees or not. In Coral Gables, there was no way for her to walk a couple of blocks from Titina de Rojas, Quinta San Jose, to the quote-unquote Africa that she had seen in Marianao's black working-class barrio of Pogolotti. In Miami, there was, as I know from experience, no way to talk to practitioners of Afro-Cuban ritual traditions or attend ceremonies without a car. And Cabrera never learned how to drive. Nor was there any way that she could have invited ailing Obonequis, like the mysterious Saibeke, whom nobody has ever been able to identify, to convalesce with her in exchange for hyper-esoteric information on Abaqua. Shortly after the revolution, Lydia's and Titina's beloved antique stuffed Quinta San Jose burned down. There was no way back. And when, after a more than decades-long hiatus since the last books that Cabrera had written in Cuba, she began publishing again in Madrid and Miami, the distance between herself and her mid-20th century ethnographic material had begun to grow to a degree where that while La Laguna Sagrada de San Joaquin can still be, of 1973, can still be counted as a masterpiece, parts of Reglas de Congo, which she published in 1979, can be read as an apology for slavery in Cuba in Tiempo de España, and so might reveal a troubling subtext to Cabrera's writing that could have been there all along. But El Monte gives us a view of Cabrera at the height of her ethnographic and imaginative powers. It is a towering achievement, and Font-Navarrete's translation does it more than justice. To be sure, I know of no contemporary ethnography that could rival El Monte in either style or flair. Nor is any of it replicable. Don't try this at home, we might say. But given anthropology's current searches for expository strategies that do not succumb to now patently suspect forms of representationalism, perhaps we might try to belatedly take a page out of Cabrera's book. Thank you.